Pre-COVID, we were constantly straining against the volume of people who need care on the South Side and usually have nowhere else to go.
Thomas Fisher joins us this week to talk about The Emergency, his new book about working as an emergency doctor in Chicago before and during the COVID pandemic.
I was expecting to find, when I started researching, that I had ancestors who had enslaved people, but I wasn't expecting to find so many different ancestors who enslaved people.
Maude Newton will be here to discuss her first book, Ancestor Trouble, about her own family's fascinating history and our culture's increased obsession with genealogy. Plus, our critics will be here to talk about the latest books they've reviewed. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's April 1st. I'm John Williams. Thomas Fisher is here. Since 2006, he has been an attending physician in the emergency department at the University of Chicago Medical Center. He is the author of The Emergency, A Year of Healing and Heartbreak in a Chicago ER. It's an account of his job during the COVID pandemic and an insider's look at a healthcare system that Fisher describes as deeply unjust and dangerous. Thomas, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's such an exciting time.
You know, being an emergency room doctor could make for an interesting memoir in any given year, I assume. Did you plan to write a book like this even before COVID, or was the pandemic what inspired you to do it?
I've been grappling with the American healthcare system for my entire career, and this book was conceptualized prior to COVID, and in fact, began prior to COVID. I mean, one of the early chapters is from November 2019. But COVID laid bare so much of what I intended to discuss from the beginning, and so in some ways, it was, weirdly fortuitous that it gave the opportunity to discuss many of the details in much more vivid relief because we had this pandemic laying out all the things that have been a problem for so long.
We'll get into those details about those problems, but now that you mention that, have you found that there's been a heightened interest in the discussion around this because it's more on the average person's mind than it might have been before the pandemic?
I think so. In the back of everybody's mind, we all know that everybody gets sick and everybody needs help when they do. But when that gets compressed by a pandemic and the risk is heightened for everybody in real time and folks are seeing their friends and colleagues and family members fall ill and go to the emergency department or the hospital, I think it becomes much more tangible and real and is accelerated for folks. That doesn't really speak to the weird polarization and misinformation that have led some to a willful ignorance, but it does put it central to people's lives and experiences. We can't just kind of ignore it anymore.
Before we get to COVID, let's just talk through your average day. I mean, your job is one of those that I could probably do for less than 3 minutes before having a nervous breakdown. So I'm interested in, what is your average shift? How many people do you see? You talk in the book about the short amount of time you have. What does your job day to day look like before the pandemic?
That is really a challenging question to answer because while there are a lot of commonalities day to day, depending on the season, the time of day, or where in the emergency department I'm situated, my shifts vary. In the busiest times, there may be 4 or 5 attending physicians working in our large 60-something bay emergency department. And our jobs are to supervise the residents and work alongside our nurses and respiratory therapists and techs and EMS members who are bringing in sick patients. And in certain areas, that means moving very quickly through lower acuity patients, trying to address problems and get people managed at home. And in other areas, it means managing very acutely ill patients sequentially, trying to resuscitate people who are critically ill. And on some days, it means sitting around and quietly enjoying company with some, really smart folks and talking about health and life. In the summer, we call it killing season in Chicago, where there's a high volume of trauma. And, if you're working in the trauma section, you can manage between 1 and 10 traumatic injuries in a 8-hour period. Or, in the winter before COVID, that was flu season, which meant we were deluged by the febrile, coughing, and sick, particularly those who had concomitant chronic illnesses that were being exacerbated by the flu. But pre-COVID, we were constantly straining against the volume of people who need care on the South Side and usually have nowhere else to go. And that always compressed our time in those most busy periods.
The details of the book are very much your job and what it's like both during COVID and, like you said, other times before the pandemic. But there's also a through line in the book, a larger sort of philosophical or political point about the healthcare system in America. You write that the devastation of the COVID pandemic was a manifestation of an old truism. You write, when America catches a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And that in neighborhoods like yours, the South Side of Chicago, Black people and poor people disproportionately use the emergency department. So you had said that the idea for this book came before COVID. I assume that has always been this central pillar of the book, and that COVID gave it an even more focused example of the things you were talking about.
Yeah. For many years, it's become apparent that our society makes people sick, and when they seek care, our healthcare system often adds insult to injury. And those conditions are not randomly distributed. And I think what COVID illuminated was how health disorders more oftenly affect Black than white folks and poor than rich folks. We saw that in a city segregated like Chicago, but we also saw it across the nation. And what's interesting about the emergency department is because it is an unselected cross-section of society, anybody can go to the emergency department, and everybody does at some point in their life. You act as a canary in the mine shaft. You can see how our societal sorting impacts the bodies of Americans and leads them to fall ill and seek care. And so before COVID, I was already trying to better understand and work on these challenges, and then COVID accelerated it and amplified it for us in real time.
You write these letters in the book. They're essentially open letters to patients of yours describing interactions you had with them, and it's a way for you to address some of these larger issues in a voice to them. And at one point you write to someone, I know you waited forever in the emergency room, and that's not an accident. What do you mean by that when you say it's not an accident?
We've created a healthcare system that is responsive to the same forces that shape our entire society. One of a profit motive, one where institutions, for-profit and non-profit alike, are working carefully to ensure that they maintain financially solvent by creating internal systems that sort across a number of dimensions, and one of them is insurance status. As a result, some pathways into the healthcare system are smooth and efficient, and others are creaky and rusty, like rusty gears. And so if one is across the country, if one is in a community where there's a large proportion of insured people, the healthcare institutions in those settings tend to be well-resourced and working very smoothly to try to intake as many people as possible in order to maximize revenue and take care of sick people. And in those settings where the payer mix is less favorable, where they're more uninsured, where there's more Medicaid people, the systems are overburdened and challenged and are less efficient in bringing sick people in. And so what you'll often see is in those emergency departments, first of all, there are fewer and further healthcare outlets in poorer communities. And those outlets that are there are overburdened, and they have fewer resources available to those that come and seek care. So for example, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the nation. In a community near my hospital, Inglewood, you'll find 12.5% of folks are uninsured. That doesn't even speak to the number of people who have Medicaid, which is a less high pay remuneration insurance than private insurance. And if you compare that community to Lakeview, where only 2% of folks are uninsured, you'll find massive difference in health status. If you overlay a map of where Chicago's health resources are, you'll find them disproportionately on the north side, where there are more insured people and more white people as well. It's not surprising.
And you write about wanting to address some of those problems, whether it's making healthcare affordable in terms of policy and insurance, universal access, But you also talk about sociological conditions, treating problems that are more endemic and more social than necessarily physical in origin, although it ends up being physical in the end. Given the busyness of your job day to day, I got the sense in the book you talk about how it's difficult to solve these problems from the inside. Is there ever a part of you that wants to try to solve it from the outside a bit? And what do you think can be done by the average person or the average politician to try to change this?
Yeah, this is so hard. I have spent a lot of my career trying to straddle the inside and the outside, taking care of sick people and understanding their problems and understanding our society as a result is just really important to me. And it's an incredible privilege being a part of people's lives and trying to help them on the days that they'll never forget, the days they had their stroke or their car accident. While at the same time, I've worked in government and insurance, trying to better understand how these systems are shaped and trying to work to align resources so that we get what we pay for. And if what we pay for is high quality, equitable care, it should be those levers that should get us there. And I've had successes and failures. I think one of the biggest challenges is even in conversations like Medicare for All, which would go a long way in solving some of these problems, we're still applying an economic tool to what is ultimately a human problem. We really need to recognize that there's some things that just should be above markets. The way we take care of each other when we are at our most vulnerable is something that shouldn't be a financial equation. It should be something that we simply owe to one another. And so the sorts of solutions that I think might help us are really not on the table right now. It really requires that we step back and think differently about what we see as shared and common goods and what we ought to deliver to one another when we are most in need. And the recognition that our humanity depends on our healthy bodies. Everything we do, our ability to imagine and produce and love, all depends on our health. And so that shouldn't simply be at the whims of profit and racial caste.
You talk about moral assessments in the book and how those are often missing from the discussion around these issues. Just how bifurcated do you see that? And do you have hope that we can bridge that gap between the market-oriented, even solutions, when people talk about wanting to make things better or creating more access for people, like you're saying, it tends to be in a sort of market-based vocabulary. Do you see areas or do you see long-term maybe places where we can start to have those more moral conversations as a society?
Maybe. I mean, I guess that's my best answers. If we do, it begins by this sort of conversation, being really honest about what it is that we're deciding. That if we are, by definition, creating in winners and losers and shaping our health around that sort of equation, that we're by definition saying some people should lose. And maybe that's not okay. Maybe we ought to look more carefully at the humanity of those around us and recognize that we all ultimately want the same thing. And when we're in these moments where we're stripped of our social titles and we are at our most human, we deserve to be treated as people who are similarly valuable and worthy. I think that requires a level of moral leadership that we're probably not trained in. We're in those moments, and I don't think that they're every day, but in those moments when we have the challenge of putting people over profit or profit over people, we never make those mistakes. Like, what does that look like? What world does that look like?
I want to get back to your experience during COVID because, as you've been eloquently talking about, the book is largely about other people's experiences of the healthcare system, even people who are close to you. The book ends with a moving section about your own mother and her experience at your hospital and the healthcare system generally. But as a doctor during the pandemic, you write about how you expect your training to kick in on the average day, even when you're very busy. There's an almost unconscious set of reflexes and experience that kicks in. And you had a friend who actually served in the military in the Middle East and told you that, don't worry, your experience will kick in and you'll be fine. But then you describe it, I think, as a new music that you had to learn a new step to the COVID. Did you ever learn it, or how quickly did it take to adjust to the new situation?
I think we're probably in a groove now, but it took a long time. I remember those early days being pretty terrifying, where normally we are accustomed to making really challenging decisions under a lot of time pressure, but we do it every day and we're accustomed to it. We've been working as a team and there's, as you referenced, there's a choreography to it. But all of a sudden we have to add in taking a moment for PPE and making sure we're checking on one another. And is the door closed to the negative pressure room? Are they even in the appropriate room for the sort of situation that we're facing? Do we have the right tools available? That took weeks and months to really adjust to. And then with each wave, we had to relearn it. All the while, many of my colleagues fell ill in the process. I was fortunate to have the love and support of a whole community of friends and family that helped to support, including, one of a very good friend of mine who had spent a lot of time in the military, who I spoke to candidly about the role of fear in preparation and execution. And he was largely right. Once you get in the moment and you're not anticipating or looking backwards, but you're actually just present, fear isn't the most prevalent portion of the experience. It's just, what do you need to do and how do you do it efficiently? But there still were all these moments in advance and behind that you still had to grapple with.
Well, and fear, I think, married with just the repetitive stress of the job during the pandemic, has led to a lot of burnout, a lot of people leaving the profession. I'm curious about that from an insider's perspective because a reader like me, I read the pieces about that and they seem alarming, but I'm curious about how that feels on the inside, where you think that crisis stands at the moment, how worried we should be about people leaving the profession, and also whether or not you've ever had during the pandemic or otherwise moments where you felt like it was too much.
I've seen a lot of people retire and a number of nurse colleagues who I've known for ages decide to take roles in different settings within the healthcare system. It's really challenging. I mean, you look at the beginning where we were society-wide in support of those on the front lines with collective efforts to flatten the curve to ensure our healthcare system wouldn't be overrun, and folks cheering out of their windows in New York, banging pots and pans and at 7:00, and all that's gone. The pandemic hasn't ended. The virus is still here. And those same folks who are working hard to ensure that our fellow citizens and community members are kept safe are under just as much strain. And so I don't know that we turn this around very quickly. I think that we're going to see more attrition, and I think it's rational. There's always been this sort of tacit agreement where people in healthcare were given additional sort of respect and prestige in exchange for the sort of personal sacrifices that they were making in order to deliver healthcare. And now that we're not seeing it, it sort of makes sense that folks would say, well, why am I making all these sacrifices? Why am I putting my own health at risk when we aren't even as a society thinking about whether or not we should be protecting our healthcare system? So I think we're going to see more and more people leaving the field, particularly on the front lines.
Obviously, that has huge consequences during times like a pandemic. I mean, that to me makes me feel like the fear of our health system being overrun exists even before you take into account that there might be attrition. So it's sort of doubly terrifying to someone to hear that. On the flip side of that, and you can tell me if this is an actual silver lining or not, but there's a moment in the book where you write that the COVID focus in the hospital had actually led to more ER efficiency. And then you and a colleague, there's a lot of gallows humor in your job, I'm sure, but there's this grim moment where you sort of say, oh, it's almost like a normal functioning ER. And then you both sort of laugh and say that it won't last because all the motives that you're talking about will kick back in. But do you think that anything long-term could change from the pandemic in a good way? Or is that just adrenaline of the moment kicking in and people making do?
I think there have been some interesting conversations about what public health ought to look like, and just the technologic and scientific miracle of getting vaccines out so quickly was just astonishing. And in those moments when all of society said we need to make our healthcare system work for this pandemic, it did work. And so I think it's a lesson in demonstrating what it could look like if we were all aligned, which doesn't mean it's going to carry over. I mean, look at our education system. We know what high functioning public schools look like. They're all over the country. We see them in many of our wealthy communities, but that doesn't mean that we've decided to do that everywhere. I think the same thing applies here. We can demonstrate what an equitable and efficient healthcare system looks like, but until we decide that that is what everybody deserves in every setting, it's an exercise and an exercise alone.
Well, it's been a long 2 years for everybody. This book really brings you to the center of that storm. The book, again, is The Emergency, A Year of Healing and Heartbreak in a Chicago ER. Thomas, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Thank you for having me on.
The critic and essayist Maud Newton joins us now. Her first book is Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation. Maud, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So your book covers a lot of bases. It's the story of both your own investigation into your family's ancestry and then a look at the way that the entire culture seems besotted with sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. But let's start where most people do when they get involved in this, which is just your own interest in your family and the first inklings you had of doing that research and where it led you.
Many years ago, I was at lunch at my day job, and I idly typed in my grandmother's mother's name, and up came a tree stretching back to an accused witch in Puritan, Massachusetts, long before Salem. I had always thought that my family in this country on both sides was Southern. So this was a real shock to me. And my mom's family, there were all these sort of larger than life stories on her side. Her father was said to have been married 13 times, and his father was said to have killed a man with a hay hook. So I was really interested in figuring out what, if anything, I could learn about these people. I mean, the stories, as I say in the book, they sounded improbable, but also, knowing my family, not unlikely. So, yeah, my interest was really kind of idle at first. I didn't expect to be able to confirm much, but I was just curious what the internet might yield if I started searching.
You grew up in Florida, and your mom's side of the family was from Texas. And it sounds like, from what you're telling us here, that there were a lot of tall tales or maybe real tales being spun from that side of the family. And so I wonder, when you were growing up, did you want to investigate any of these things, or why did your curiosity peak at the moment that it did? Was there a particular reason?
So my mom and her mom are amazing storytellers, and they were these larger than life stories. They would kind of build on each other. I didn't learn about the 13 marriages or the hay hook until I was quite a bit older, but I just always had this sort of excitement and energy around my mother's family. So the idea that I might be able to verify some of these stories that seemed so impossible was really interesting to me. Once I found this accused witch, I thought, oh, maybe the internet can help me verify or not some of these possible tall tales in my family history.
And when you were starting this, were all of basically the tools that we have now available, or what did the internet look like at this point? I know that things change so fast in terms of what's available to us.
Yes, I should have said this was more than 2 decades ago. So, or really about exactly 2 decades ago. So there was no 23andMe. There was maybe a precursor to Ancestry.com, but I was not familiar with it. It was just sort of like the tumbleweed version of the internet, where there would just be sort of these random pages about family histories and, now abandoned websites put together by regular people rather than these sort of vast repositories that are now connected into records and our DNA.
And so when you first started this, was there a lot of more old-fashioned digging, going through archives, and I assume trying to talk to family members about things? Is that how you started?
There was a lot of that. My mom, in about 2007, she sent me a large box of documents and photos and old family letters. And that really was my first sort of deep dive into archival research around this. And soon I found myself sending off for death certificates and birth certificates and marriage certificates. And, I really got pulled into the sort of old school archival aspects of it. Ultimately, on my father's side, I ended up hiring a researcher to look at some archives at the University of Mississippi, where it turned out that my great aunt had some newspaper columns.
As you explored and learned more, and in some cases, didn't learn more or met with resistance, what was the story on your side? We'll get to the sort of larger cultural story, but what were the stories that you wanted to tell in the book? Not just the tall tales, but the larger story about what you learned about your family and the process you went through.
So on my mother's side, there was a lot of larger than life stuff and also a lot of mental illness that I was interested in and concerned about. But on my father's side, my father is a very overt white supremacist, a very extreme person.
And you've been estranged from him for a while.
I have. I've been estranged from him, unfortunately, for more than 25 years. He was the kind of person who actually defended slavery, taught my sister and me that birds of a feather flock together was one of his favorite expressions, meaning that we should just sort of hang out with other white people. I was actually punished when I was a kid for questioning this history of our family. So I was expecting to find when I started researching that I had ancestors who had enslaved people, but I wasn't expecting to find so many different ancestors who enslaved people.
And this is mostly on your dad's side?
It is mostly on my dad's side, although as I write in the book, I thought it was entirely on his side. And without really realizing it, I had sort of divided my family into the racist side and the not racist side, or the not fundamentally racist side, meaning my mom's side. And then I discovered that I had ancestors who enslaved Black people on that side as well. I discovered that the ancestors I had in Puritan New England were deeply involved in cheating Indigenous people on those lands and, eventually becoming involved in part of the genocide that happened in Western Massachusetts in King Philip's War. So that was an awakening for me. I had always, frankly, felt a little smug about my willingness to acknowledge slavery and to not sort of deny it in the way or overlook it in the way that some people I knew did. But I realized, oh, this is not limited to my father's side of the family. This is all over my family, including in the line of my beloved maternal grandmother.
So what other, I guess what we could call unhappy surprises were there in this process? I feel like overall it was a process that you went into knowing that there would be some, to say the least, not just skeletons, but sort of known things that you wouldn't like to find. What else did you fill in that was either troubling or just complicated your vision of where you would come from and who your people were?
so many different things. It really started to feel more and more like a novel in a way the more I researched these different people, the sort of joy of discovery and the plot twists or the horror of discovery. So on my mother's side, I discovered that the great grandfather who had been said to kill a man with a hay hook, that was true. But I had pictured him as this sort of swashbuckling hothead. And in fact, it was an accident. He had been instrumental in sending a neighbor who may have been a good friend of his at one time to prison through his testimony in a trial. The neighbor had been accused of trying to rape his own stepdaughter. And he had attacked my great grandfather, who then tried to fend him off with this hay hook. So it wasn't anything like what I pictured. And that was really moving to me because I myself had been molested by a family member when I was young. And so to see that this great grandfather of mine, who I had thought was this kind of over the top, almost fun villain or something, was actually, a protector was really deeply moving. But I also discovered that my self-given namesake, Maud Newton, my great aunt, she turned out to be a writer. And I was always really fascinated by her because nobody liked to talk about her on my father's side. And so I figured that there was some sort of story I wasn't privy to. And I discovered that in her writings, she was not the sort of rebellious person in the Mississippi Delta that I had hoped she would be, or at least she wasn't rebellious in the ways I had hoped. She was very much on board with segregation. A lot of the stuff she wrote in some ways ties so directly into this moment that we're in right now, where voting rights are being eroded and we're really confronting systemic racism. And it's almost like a direct callback to the kind of stuff she was writing in the middle of the last century.
Before we get to the cultural umbrella here, this is a very big question, I realize, but I'm curious about whether or not there was something you overall hoped to either learn or feel in piecing all of this together, and whether or not that happened in the end.
Yeah. As you know, the book looks at spiritual practices around ancestors toward the end. And I knew that the book would eventually land in that place, but I wasn't really sure what that would entail or what I would find. I had a sense that spiritual practices around ancestors have been important to people across the world and across time, and that we in the post-Enlightenment West, dominated by white European thought, are the aberration in not thinking about a continuing relationship between the living family and the dead. But I didn't know that for certain, and I really wasn't knowledgeable at all about those kinds of histories. And so that was both an exciting thing that I knew I would research and a kind of scary one, because I have this history of religious extremism in my family. My mother started a church in my living room when I was a kid and performed exorcisms there and all that kind of stuff. So I was really interested as I started to see where I would end up with that and what I would find. And what I have found is a sort of really strong sense of a personal connection to my ancestors that I didn't have before, and one that feels really healthy to me. And in the book I go through some of the more maybe out there things that I tried and I learned about in the course of arriving at this deeper understanding. But, what I would carry forward and sort of suggest to people is whether or not we want to think about a literal spiritual connection with our ancestors, allowing ourselves to really imagine our ancestors in all of their fullness, the difficult and bad things that they did, and of course the wonderful things that they did, can just be a really kind of transformative experience. And I've come to find that the line between imagination and spirituality has really become a lot more porous over the course of writing this book.
Another big question, but why not? Since we're dealing with big questions here. You write in the book a lot about nature versus nurture, about heredity and genetics, and also about the stories we tell ourselves about where we come from and our families, and how sometimes just those stories are more powerful than the actual physical inheritances we might have from people. How did writing and researching the book change the way you think about those things, or did it? Or do you feel like it changed where you are on that spectrum of what you think is most influential to people and what really drives our lives the most, whether it's literally the people we come from or what the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from?
That is such a great question. And the truth is that my understanding of all of that is so much more complex than it was when I started writing the book. And I continue to feel that it's a mystery that we're never going to solve entirely. My personal feeling, is that it's all of the above. And I read much more deeply into genetics and epigenetics, of course, than I was able to describe in the book. But it was important for me as a layperson to really understand what science says we can know about the possibility of inheriting changes to the epigenome, which essentially means the possibility of inheriting changes that can affect the way our genes are manifested.
Right. Inherited trauma.
Exactly. Yeah, intergenerational trauma. And so some scientists really scoff and recoil at that notion, especially hard scientists. But, science does show that this definitely happens in earthworms. It definitely happens in plants. There is, depending on your perspective, some compelling suggestion that it does happen in mice. And I think the sort of human exceptionalism around this is it's, to me, it's a little bit funny.
And maybe wishful thinking.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So, but I didn't come away with a sort of aha solution, or sort of thesis around that. Then again, I'm not really that kind of person. I enjoy kind of existing in the uncertainty. And the more I can understand the uncertainty, the more enjoyment I get.
Yeah, I'm with you. I tend to be anti-theses in books. Well, the idea of earthworms inheriting trauma is at least potentially the start of a New Yorker cartoon, I think.
Well, I've slightly misspoken here. I don't think we've shown that they can inherit trauma, but we've shown, or scientists rather, have shown that changes to the epigenome can be passed down.
Okay. I still like the idea of earthworms inheriting trauma. So before I let you go, I'd like to know, because it's so interesting that the way you write about ancestor reverence in the book, and also the way that you have come to, I think, a deeper relationship with the past and with the people in your family. And like you said, accepting the warts and all. Given those warts and how honest you are about those, what is that side of the, I suppose, maybe the reconciliation in your subtitle? What sits in you in terms of what you feel you've gained by staring at the not necessarily good side of things and letting that sort of settle in you and accepting that as part of your inheritance, whatever percentage it is?
So, one thing that's really important to me coming out of this book is to share the idea that by acknowledging the harmful things our ancestors did, and especially the ones that we can see still playing out on a cultural level, the legacies of slavery, the legacies of our treatment of Indigenous people, we can really free ourselves from a clenched relationship to those histories. And we can also more clearly see the way forward. And so I personally, the one thesis I do have is that it's really important for those of us with those histories to get personal in telling our stories, our family stories, so that we're not having this kind of hectoring discussion about critical race theory and whatnot, but we're saying, hey, my ancestors enslaved people, and here's how I feel about that.
I think that you're arguing against repression and denial, which I'm all for. Arguing against that.
Yeah. But then the second part of that is that for me personally, really sitting with these histories and writing about them and meditating on them and feeling my way into them has really opened up this creative, imaginative space for me around my ancestors, this kind of sense of a spiritual connection or actual spiritual connection, depending on your point of view. And I find that it has really helped me to show up better in the world and to have a better sense of what came from my ancestors that I want to carry forward. So there's a lot less confusion now about what's possible for me. And that's been a really important transformation through the book.
Well, you get into a lot of big subjects in the book. I got a little sidetracked, as listeners can probably understand, by your own family's history, which is so fascinating. But there's a lot to chew on in the book, both personal and cultural. The book, again, is Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation by Maud Newton. Maud, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm joined now by two of the Times' book critics, Dwight Garner and Molly Young, to talk about books they've recently reviewed and other subjects. Hello, you two.
Hey, John.
Hey, John.
Molly, let's start with you. You recently reviewed a book by Elena Ferrante, which is not the usual type of book. What are the contents of that book?
It's kind of a fun concept. So an introduction to the book explains that Ferrante was invited to deliver a series of lectures on any topic. The only constraint was that the topic had to be of interest to a, quote, general audience. And the lectures were to be delivered in Italy at a university. And she agreed to the assignment and wrote the lectures. And then the pandemic happened. And so in-person events went poof and disappeared. But since she'd already written the essays, I guess she continued to work on them. And they were delivered belatedly, maybe a year after they were meant to be delivered, by an actress performing as Ferrante to a live audience. And you can actually find part of the lecture on YouTube. And it's kind of fun to watch the actress, and you can see the audience, and they're all wearing masks and watching raptly as this woman delivers the words of the anonymous Ferrante.
So presumably, given Ferrante's anonymity, the original plan, even pre-pandemic, was for someone else to deliver lectures in person, that she agreed to write them, but that she wouldn't appear and deliver them herself.
I assume so. And part of me wonders, I mean, there's so many fun options. The actress who delivered the lectures was fantastic, but I was just thinking there's so many other possibilities. You could have a puppet deliver the lectures. You could have a disembodied voice being piped in, like Wizard of Oz style. There are a lot of possibilities there, but I think the one they went with was probably best in service of the lectures themselves, which were very, very well written and interesting.
Yeah, the actress, we should say, is Manuela Mandraccia, and you can find her, like you said, on YouTube. So the pieces themselves, these are relatively short pieces, and they're addressed to the topics of reading and writing, essentially the basics. People who are anonymous tend to seem mysterious, so it's hard for me to picture Ferrante giving 5 writing tips, or her Elmore Leonard version of how to write and how not to write. I assume that this is a bit broader than that.
It is, although there is something interesting about her anonymity in that it's never felt to me like it's something that's especially mannered. It seems as though it's more of she's always talked about it as more of a pragmatic choice as a way to write about sensitive topics or controversial topics freely, and using anonymity as a way to communicate more clearly rather than a way to obscure herself or her ideas. So I think there's something kind of special about her version of anonymity, and it's one reason why, even though apparently her quote unquote real identity was uncovered by an Italian journalist using records of some kind, I think it might be possible to figure out her real name, but I've chosen to remain kind of blissfully unaware. I think that's more interesting than actually finding out who this person is.
Does she address the anonymity at all in these lectures, or her desire for it, or is that something she's just covered well before?
She's covered it well before. I think she does circle around the idea of how the personality of an author or the brand of an author can create a sort of fog that precludes or prevents people from really accessing the words freely. So she kind of gets to that idea, but it's not something that is a subject of this book, which is, as the title or as the subtitle indicates, is really about the joys of reading and writing.
Here's an either or question for you. Do you feel like the book is something that Ferrante diehards would be interested in, or alternately, do you not even really have to be familiar with her work yet in order to enjoy it?
Well, it falls into that wonderful category of books that are about reading, which are broadly appealing to all sorts of readers for obvious reasons. She's just a fascinating and very unusual thinker about these questions of what it means to sit down and work through a text. And I've read a zillion books by writers on reading and writing, and this one stuck out to me as being quite original in her approach. There was one portion in particular that really struck me, and this might be obvious to other people, but it was very novel to me, where she talks about how every time you read a book, you're reading not just that author's words, but the palimpsest of words that influenced that author, and then the books that influenced those books, and going back in time in an endless loop of faint, ghostly influence. She has just a lot of beautiful observations like that I think are interesting to anyone, not just the Ferrante heads.
Dwight, speaking of reading a zillion books in a category, I'm going to ask you something from a reader this week rather than talk about your recent reviews, and it comes from someone named Eli Powell in Austin, Texas. He heard you talking about Patricia Highsmith's diaries on the podcast a few months back when you reviewed them, and quite favorably reviewed them. And you mentioned on that podcast that you are a big fan of the genre of diaries and letters and correspondence by writers. And I think he was most interested in learning about some of your favorite collections of letters by writers. And so I thought I'd give you a chance to stump for a few of them.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I might just combine letters and diaries. And I do like to find that favorite writers of mine have collections. I mean, God, one of the things about books of letters and diaries and journals is they tend to be from writers, because A, writers write better than most people about things, and B, writers are the kind of people who tend to get their journals and letters published. And so it tends to be a literary genre. I mean, both of these genres tend to be pretty literary. But it's funny, in recent years, I've reviewed two books that I can't recommend highly enough. One is called New York City Diaries, which was an edited collection of various people's diary entries, sort of collected up into a sort of sequential, it runs from January to December, and various people's journals, like maybe 500 different contributors, and it reads like a great history lesson, how New York City came to be. And ditto, there's a similar one about Los Angeles that I'm blanking on the name now, but it's easy to find. And I like those because they're quite earthy. And surprising people have written great books of diaries. And I'm thinking of Richard Burton, the actor. His are just amazing. He was such a literate man and a funny man, and they're just charming as hell. And I love Tina Brown's Vanity Fair diaries that she kept while editing that magazine. She just had such a great perch in which to watch New York City power, and she's quite funny about all of that as well.
I have a couple of letter collections that I remember enjoying many years ago. One was Raymond Chandler, the mystery novelist. He has this very cranky persona. He's always upset about his publishing plans and the people who are dealing with his books, but he gets it across in a way that I found really entertaining. I'm actually reading Iris Murdoch's letters right now. You reviewed that a few years back, Dwight.
I love those. And I loved Ralph Ellison's letters. I think his are particularly great because you see him in Harlem, you see him in Vermont struggling to write Invisible Man. You see him in Rome after he's been famous. He's running around the city looking for soul food because he just misses the food from home. And Ellison's letters are beautiful. Beckett has written great letters. Jessica Mitford, anything that Mitford sisters, well, at least some of them have written is great. Jessica Mitford's, who was an aristocrat, came to the United States, became a crusading journalist, and her essays are called Decca, and they're just great.
Yeah, I have Nancy Mitford's letters somewhere around here, but I haven't cracked into them yet.
Well, yeah, Nancy, she has a great book. She traded letters with Evelyn Waugh, and the Mitford Waugh letters are just really cynical and funny and sort of bitchy and on point.
That's the thing. I mean, letters are the one place, especially where you really can make a case for, I don't want to say the worse the person, the better the letters, but
right.
You definitely don't want to judge people if you're looking for a letters collection. The poet Philip Larkin has a great big brick of a letters collection, and all the problematic things about him that people unearth now are probably on display in there. But there's also just this completely candid, you just get people at full gallop in a way that you don't capture in a lot of other genres.
Yeah, I mean, I read Barack Obama's last book, the memoir, and I kept thinking, it's good. It's really good. But I kept thinking, what I really like is sort of a day by day, like if he had kept in real time, not just, I don't know, like what he wore that day and why, and who did he have breakfast with, and what did he think of X? There are some diaries like that. Chips Cannon is a British politician and diplomat who kept journals like that mid-century. Anyway, but I love the immediacy. You were right to say Larkin, all of his sort of warts and pimples came out in that collection, but that's what made them really fascinating too.
It's a pretty endless list. We'll add to it maybe in a future segment. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.